Hello, welcome to the All or Nothing podcast. Our official sponsors are KR Couriers and Transport Limited. This is a Northwest based courier company delivering all across the UK. They can assist in home moves and removals to large, heavy and bulky items, collections and drop-offs. Fast, safe and reliable deliveries. Please get in touch for a free quote. You'll find all the information within the description. Thank you. Hello everybody and welcome to the Billy Moore podcast, and today's special guest is Neil Gillingham. Now Neil, you've got one hell of a story, mate. We're getting ready to hear it, so tell us a little bit about yourself, and thanks for coming on, by the way.
Yeah, firstly, thank you.
Let's make sure we speak into that, mate.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it, giving my grandmother a voice. Obviously, she's been missing for 37 years now. Grandfather's back in prison, recently recalled. So it's a bit of a journey. We're going to share it, and hopefully your viewers will enjoy it as best they can. But perhaps someone will see it and they'll be able to help me and my family be able to get closure that we so desperately deserve.
So tell us a little bit about growing up and what it was like for you, because when you sent me the synopsis of the story, obviously I've read a little bit about it, and it was quite, it was quite inviting.
Yeah, it's I think it's different, in terms of my background. So ultimately, to start off, I was born 32 years ago. I'm 32 years of age now. I'm a father these days, and we'll get to that in a moment, and sort of where we are. But where the journey ultimately started is 32 years ago. I was born into the East Midlands. When I was ultimately 3 years of age, my story really started. My grandfather was ultimately convicted of a £1 million life insurance fraud. So in 1993, him, his solicitor, his mistress, and a third party took a yacht over to Guernsey. They had dinner in Guernsey, and at just gone 1 o'clock in the morning, they made a mayday call from the yacht to say that my grandfather had fallen overboard. There was 36 hours of search rescue, both by air as well as sea, and no body was found. And what later transpired ultimately is that my grandfather had faked his own death and was living in Brighton 4 months later as a woman. And that really kicked off what was it that changed our lives. To this day, it still impacts our lives. So what had transpired when they started looking in terms of where my grandfather was, and when they started realising that this actually was a man that's involved in quite an audacious fraud. It was £850,000. In today's money, that's like 1.6 odd million. And what transpired was that my grandmother had been missing for 8.5 years. She'd literally just vanished. And what makes it, I think, even more upsetting is that ultimately my grandfather's mistress had gone into the police station pretending to be my grandmother, wearing a wig, to say, "My name's Carole Packman, I'm alive and well and I want nothing further to do with my family." And because of the channels that had been communicated down, i.e. the police, the official channels, right, is that my mum took that as gospel. So she never thought anything more. And my grandparents were, interesting people. I'm not going to sit here and say that they were, from the outside, they were your epitome of middle-class British couple. Rolex watches. My grandfather, they had his and hers E-types on the drive. Very, very nice detached property in Bournemouth. He was a catch-me-if-you-can figure. Both my grandparents were. My grandmother had left school at 15 years of age. She had met my grandfather, who was a few years older than her. My grandfather, by the age of 18, had been convicted of a GBH and an armed robbery on his own parents' post office. And so there was this really big sort of background story, right? But ultimately, a lot of this wasn't known until many, many moons later. And so what had transpired is that he had thrown himself over a yacht. They started looking to find out where my grandmother is. And then suddenly, where is Carole? No one's seen her for 8 years. And that's when then they started making inquiries. So we became the first people to convict someone of murder.
Without a body?
Without a body, yeah. We were one of the first cases, and we were the first case to ever convict someone twice of murder on purely circumstantial evidence with no body. But, we're jumping a few steps ahead. So ultimately is that they started looking into my grandmother's disappearance, and they realised that there was not one trace. The passport hadn't been used, and there was
no footprints at all?
Nothing. The last known sighting was a visit to her doctor in June, between the 11th and the 15th of June 1985. She had seen her doctor for a routine checkup appointment, and she had shared the news that she was planning on leaving my grandfather. So in terms of, if we was to go back, because the murder obviously happened prior to my arrival in this world. It's 1985. I was born in 1989, sorry. My grandfather was convicted of life insurance in 1993, so I was 4 years of age. And then 3 years later, he was obviously convicted of the first time of the murder. I was 6, going on 7 years of age. So people have got a mental timeline. So 1985, my grandparents came back from Canada. They'd been working in Canada. They were aircraft designers. They designed their electrical draftsmen and women, ultimately. I've still got the original copies of Concorde at home in my son's bedroom, which is pretty cool. But they blagged their way in. And what had happened was my grandfather had met someone in a pub. He was wearing a nice Rolex. And he asked him what he'd done. And he said, I design aircraft. He asked him what his name was. He ended up going to Cranfield University. He stole the person's credentials, pretended to be him, and blagged his way into the aviation industry. Now, to give you a flavour, back in the 70s and 80s, my grandparents were earning £125 an hour. So we can put it, they were earning big money, very successful people. They were committing huge amounts of fraud.
Both of them, yeah?
Both of them.
Yeah, so
50, 60, 70 grand comfortably. Each time they went on a train or on a plane, the Rolex would get stolen, the house would get burgled, the Louis Vuitton suitcases with all the contents would be stolen. And, you know, they were submitting insurance claims 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 grand. So
how didn't he come on top with all this, though? It's mad, isn't it?
The thing is that my grandfather was a very, very... we're not stupid people, none of us. I left school at 14, right? And, you know, I'm no none of us are Richard Bransons, but given our backgrounds, and it's all been quite dysfunctional, really. We've all done quite well. We've prospered. You know, we all own our own homes. You know, you see where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
You know, none of us have... I think you're a sculptor, ultimately. You know, you're the creator of your own destiny, right? But from their side is that they were so audacious, and because they could conduct themselves eloquently and they could articulate themselves, you could believe them.
Yeah.
And you would never have suspected that my grandparents, they weren't involved in organised crime with others. They were very much insular. They travelled around the world. They lived very, very well. My mum lived obviously very, very well off the back of it as well. But, you know, my mum was reading by the age of 2. She could do puzzles upside down. She used to go to, we know this because there was people that gave evidence in court, but, you know, she was going to the shop and collecting the newspapers, the daily newspapers by 3.5 years of age. She was walking to the shop, crossroads and all sorts. So, yeah, it was a crazy story, but sort of, yeah, 1993, 1985, the murder. He moved the mistress in. Patricia had moved into the house. So what happened was they'd moved back from Canada. My grandfather decided to set up an insurance firm with a guy called Lee Green in Bournemouth. And the first person they hired was Patricia. And so my grandparents were in financial difficulty at the time. They were doing fraud still. But in an effort to save the house, they didn't want the house to be repossessed, right? They came up with quite a plan, what my grandfather did. And that was, he managed to convince Patricia to sell her flat and give him the money, give my grandparents the money. She moved into the flat, into the house, into the family home. She was in the spare room. Occasionally she was sharing a room with my mum. And Russell had moved himself out of the matrimonial bed into the spare room. And those two then actively started an affair. My grandmother was still living there. I can't begin to imagine the environment, the atmosphere, knowing that your husband is fucking another woman right under your nose, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And I think after a period of time, it wouldn't have been very long, 12 to 18 months, that's when my grandmother said, enough's enough, I'm going to leave you, I'm going to take you for everything you've got. So she'd seen her solicitor, and when my grandfather obviously caught wind of it, she paid the ultimate penalty. And she vanished. Literally. There's no sign. There's never been a sign of her. No body, no DNA, no witnesses, Just that one meeting with the doctor. Yeah, so that was June 1985. Sorry, that was June of 1985. My mum was kicked out at 16, so my grandfather then said, once my grandmother had disappeared, he said to my mum one day, I don't want you living here. It's just Patricia and I now in the house. He changed his name from Packman, which is the family name, to Causley, which is his mistress's name. And at that point, ultimately, she had literally just replaced my grandmother. She wore her Rolex, wore her clothes. My grandmother didn't take anything. It was quite literally like someone had just picked her up and replaced her with Patricia. And Patricia went to go over to Canada, and she lived in Canada under my grandmother's passport and green card. She was kicked out by the Royal Mountain Police. I think what started to it didn't arouse suspicion at the time, but later on it became very clear, because you wouldn't have gone over to Canada if you believed that someone was genuinely alive. You wouldn't go over to Canada and go and work in the same office that woman had worked in only a few years prior. And it wasn't until someone said, "Who's that? That's not Carole. Who's that?" And then they realised that it was an impersonator, and the Royal Mountain Police arrested her and deported her from the country. She got deported. She came back over to the UK. My grandfather came back over as well. And for the next 8 years, they lived very well with no one believing. And ultimately, how they managed to get away with it is that, as I say, Patricia had gone into the police station, said to the police, "I'm alive and well, I want nothing to do with my daughter anymore."
So that was enough for them at that time.
Just go, okay. Yeah. They closed the missing persons file.
But didn't she go in with some kind of like information or passports?
They never even checked. They never
identification at all. Nothing. They didn't even ask.
Didn't even ask. They just took it on face value that was Carole Packman.
Wow.
And they closed the missing persons file. And so for 8.5 years, my mum didn't know. And it wasn't until he threw himself over the yacht that suddenly my mum's then panicked. The police have turned up. Your father's missing at sea, presumed dead. That was the official report. Newspaper articles have obviously started going out because of, businessmen, yachtsmen, blah, you know what the media are like. And they painted my grandfather, as a damsel in distress that was bobbing around the English Channel. It couldn't be further from the truth. And he was living in a guest house, And
he found him living there as a woman.
Yeah. Yeah, he was often dressing up, cross-dressing. He was a little bit of a weirdo, but yeah. So it's crazy when you start actually looking into it, and that's when, when the police knocked on the door and they said your father's missing at sea. Yeah. The first thing my mum said is, "You need to find my mum," and they went, "We was with his wife." My mum went, "But it's not possible. My mum's been missing for 8 odd years. You guys told me that she didn't want anything to do with us. Why would she be on a yacht with him?" And then that's when it then transpired that the woman that was claiming to be Russell's wife was actually Patricia. Well, if you're claiming to be his wife, and how the conversation went is ultimately when the police turned up to say that Russell had fallen overboard, is that my mum said, I need to speak to Patricia, when they said that his wife was on board. And she didn't really think much of it at the time. She thought it was just sort of more of a cross wires, And so she said, I need to speak to Patricia. And Patricia's opening line was this. The phone rang, my mum answered, and Patricia said, I've lost my husband. And my mum went, he's not your husband, he's still married to my mother. And her words were, fuck off, Sam. I'm grieving. I've got my own grief to deal with. And put the phone down on my mum. And she knew at the time. And so what makes it even worse is obviously my mum was then desperate to find her mother because she needed her mother. But then to find out that the person that you thought was missing is alive, and the person you thought was alive is missing, and the person that you thought was missing is the person that killed. You see where I'm coming from? Yeah. And my mum trying to process and put all those pieces together and join those pieces of the jigsaw together and bring those.
Where was you in this all as growing up?
I was a toddler.
Yeah, so you.
I was a toddler, and oddly, I'm writing my book at the moment, Billy. Yeah. And I said to you, obviously you're a father now. Congratulations. You'll know this. I don't think you become a man until you become a father. your life changes, your priorities change. I call him my saviour.
Yeah.
And he's very special to me. But I'm now starting to relive a lot of that trauma myself, you know. And one of my friends said to me, they said, Neil, how are you going to explain, how did your parents explain to you that your grandmother was murdered and your grandfather is the killer? And I said my first memory, I blurted it ultimately, but I said, my first memory, my parents owned a Mark 1 Golf. It was orange with brown cloth interior. It was horrible, right? I was 6 or 7. It was at Winchester Crown Court. It was a 6 p.m. news bulletin on ITV, I think. And I saw my mum being chased by paparazzi. I turned to my father's mother and I said, why is my mummy being chased by those men? I didn't understand it. I was a kid, right? She turned the TV off. My mum came in. She was crying. Obviously, she's just been given evidence against her own father in a court of law. And I said, Mummy, what's happened? And she said, don't worry, mate. She gave me a hug. That was my first memory at 6 of finding out. And I was protected to a certain degree from the details. But you can't go through a murder investigation at the level that we did and not be impacted as a child. And so I think that the first trial, being honest with you, didn't impact me directly because I was still too little. The second trial, my second murder trial, that's the one that hit and that slapped hard. And I think that the ripple effect was even greater because I was now 14. And if it's, you know, when they convicted my grandfather, and it's a fascinating case, the first trial, is that ultimately they'd convicted him on the evidence of 3 different prisoners. So whilst he was serving the sentence, so when he was convicted of the fraud, they find him, they prosecute him, they prosecute Patricia, right? They prosecute Anthony, his solicitor. And they go to prison. My grandfather gets 2 years, his solicitor gets 3 years, Patricia gets a 12-month community order. Right? Teflon Trish has never spent one day in prison. To this day, she still lives in a house funded by my grandmother. So when he was in prison, he said it could be a lot worse. I could be here for a murder. And his cellmate started probing a little bit further in terms of what's this guy going on about. Now, one of them we knew was trying to get a deal. So we disregarded what he was saying because we knew that he was ultimately trying to benefit. The second prisoner we relied upon, and the third prisoner we relied upon. And ultimately, my grandfather had given various accounts to different people, both in prison as well as outside of prison, family, friends. Where's Carole? Oh, she's left. She's gone with a man in a red Porsche over to Germany. Oh, Carole's secured a contract over, I think she's working over in Italy or Switzerland. Oh, last time I heard, Carole wrote to me, she was in Canada. And so there was various accounts, and then, but these accounts to the prisoners, he said one account was that he had put a bag over her head, shot of gas, knocked her out, and dissolved her body in acid. Another one was that he'd put her down a mine shaft. My grandfather's niece, unfortunately, died when she was 13 at boarding school of a heart attack. And he even said that he'd put my grandmother's body on top of his niece's body in the cemetery. What did they have to do? Go and probe his own niece's grave. And he said to his sister at the time, your daughter didn't die, she escaped. That gives you a calibre of the type of person we're dealing with in terms of vindictiveness, right? Mm-hmm. So he gives these accounts to these different prisoners. They go to the authorities, make statements. Now, the key one was a guy called Murphy. And Murphy was out of prison by now. So Murphy had no benefit. There was nothing that he could have got out of his trial. His cases were all done. His sentence was served. He had nothing to be able to...
There's no end goal for him,
there was no benefit. And so we convicted my grandfather on unanimously of murder on purely circumstantial evidence. And from 1996, when my grandfather was convicted, to 2003, we had appeal after appeal, pretty much every year. New angle was coming in from his legal team, and that was very difficult, because if it wasn't bad enough that especially for my mum. My mum was very poorly. She had she ended up with pleurisy and all sorts. She was really, really poorly. Couldn't work. We didn't have a lot of money. I grew up in a 3-bedroom council house, mid-terrace council house. I may have a different accent these days, but in terms of where I come from, my roots, we didn't have a pot to piss in. We didn't have 2 pennies to rub together when I was a child. And my father was a crack and heroin addict. He was a drug addict. He suffered from addiction. My mum, bless her, is a very hard-working lady. Probably the strongest, most resilient woman I know. She's never turned to drugs. She's never turned to alcohol. She worked 3 jobs when I was a kid. She used to give me a piggyback around on a mountain bike because we couldn't afford a car. You get the type of person and woman. Very staunch. Mum. She now runs... she's a site manager for a very well-known national builder.
Okay, so you mentioned your dad, a cracking heroin addict. He was a cracking heroin addict, and your mother was teetotal by the sounds of it. She was stoned. She doesn't even drink. Can I identify with the similarities? My mum, similar. She didn't drink. She didn't take drugs. My dad, he drank alcoholically, and it's not for me to say he was an alcoholic, but he did drink alcoholically. He sat at home with a can next to him constantly, and if he was out, he was coming home and he was blitzed, and and that's just how it was. But my mum, similar kind of staunch woman. 6 kids, looked after us all, give us everything that she could give us, and we didn't, and that wasn't much, but she'd give us half of what she had, if not all of it. So I can understand, the feelings. But how did it have an impact on you, all that growing up? I mean,
look, so as I say, the first trial in 1996, grandfather's convicted unanimously, goes off to jail, right? We're none the wiser. It doesn't impact us. It doesn't impact me. I can't say, does it impact the family environment? Of course it did. Yeah. But the trauma manifested itself, as I say, my father started having an affair with heroin. That's got its own demons in terms of the shit that it brings to your front door.
Oh, there's consequences.
You've got, the tempers, you've got the anger, you've got people coming to the door, money's owed. Most people will know is that if you're, ultimately if you're using, you're probably supplying. And if you're supplying, you're probably using. And so that brings its own dramas, its own baggage to the front door. And when I was growing up, we'd have all sorts come in. Knives were the regular. And other weapons and what have you, and shit coming to your door and people having to be chased away and dealt with, right? And you grow up around that sort of environment. Now, I didn't realise, it probably wasn't until later on, and as I say with my little boy now, and I look back and I realise how dysfunctional that environment was, right? And I'd never...
expose him.
I'd never expose him to that.
To anything like that.
I'm not saying my parents are at fault. I love my parents dearly. They're both together, both still together.
But your mum and your dad are still, brilliant.
Yeah, still together. We're a very strong family unit.
How's your dad now?
Dad's been clean for 17 years.
Wow.
I'm very proud of him.
Yeah.
Very proud of him.
So you should be.
Yeah.
And so he should be.
That's fucking hard.
Right, and it's not easy, yeah.
And very proud of him for doing that. And I always say to him, you've got nothing to be ashamed of. But I think how it really impacted was in 2003. The Criminal Justice Act was changed. There was various changes within the Criminal Justice Act, which finally allowed people to be tried twice, obviously. My grandfather won his appeal. And anybody that's interested, ultimately, in technicalities and how things are overturned, was that what had transpired is Murphy, in my book, I've labelled the chapter Murphy's Law, because everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. Mm-hmm. The one prisoner that had nothing to benefit from any of this had lied. And how he had lied is that he was asked if he would ever given evidence in a similar set of circumstances in the past in court. And he answered no. It transpired that in 1960-something, he was in a very similar set of circumstances where he gave evidence against a man who was alleged to have murdered his wife. And that man was convicted of his wife's murder. Now, fast forward, obviously, however many, 25, 30 odd years, 40 years now by the time we get to the appeal, right, from that evidence, the defence had picked that. And that one question, have you ever given evidence in another court case? It wasn't even anything to do with my grandfather. That undermined our whole case. And so they automatically quashed it. Now, I was 14. any 14, any teenager ultimately that's going, you have stages, right? You've got baby, toddler, adolescence, you know, in terms of, you know, being a kid and then going into your teenage years, and then, you know, you're an adult, right? And you make those transitions. And if it wasn't, you know, you've got all those changes going on in your body, you've got emotions that you're trying to deal with, you know, you're becoming going from a boy to a teenager to a man, right? And I was 14, and, you know, suddenly we were hitting national newspapers again. It was such a big case. We weren't protected, really, in my view. I wasn't protected in terms of shielded enough by... there was too much interest in the case, and there was too much interest in our lives in terms of just how has this all came about, you know what I mean? Because fortunately for us, is that there's never been a repeat of our story ever in criminal legal history in the UK. There isn't another one of our cases. So in terms of where the killer as well is in the family and the victim, it's just madness, right? So 14, we're hitting national newspapers. I was attacked. I was attacked at school. What had happened is that I was sat in a maths lesson. How it all started was I was sat in a maths lesson, and the lad next to me, I won't mention his name because I don't want either of us to have issue. I can't be doing with all the hassle, right? But the lad that was sat next to me, ultimately, his father was a police officer, and his father's name, and I will say his name because it's in the media, is Stephen Eaton. Mm-hmm. Now, Stephen Eaton was a bent copper. He was dismissed from the police force in 2008 odd. But 4 years prior to that, in 2004, there was a domestic incident at my family home. And Stephen Eaton, PC Stephen Eaton, was attendance. He was one of the officers. So he's turned up at the house with his mates, with his cronies, right? Mm-hmm. And there was, as I say, there was a domestic dispute. And my father was arrested. Now, during the course of that, obviously that officer was privy to quite a lot of our family info as the arresting officer. My grandfather, what was going on obviously there. We had panic alarms in our house. All of our phone calls were recorded inbound because of obviously my grandfather and the threat that they believed that my grandfather posed. And there was various things. My grandfather had wrote a book ultimately about having me kidnapped and murdered by a paedophile ring when I was sick, a bit younger.
So he wrote a book?
Yeah, it wasn't published. It was seized by the police in a lockup. Yeah. It was found with some dodgy porn, not illegal, but some... Ultimately, there was pictures of my grandfather as a 50-year-old man in a cot, dressed as a baby, sucking on his thumb. Stuff like that.
Weird gear.
Weird. Yeah, so it's not it wasn't illegal.
Just
odd.
Yeah.
Weird. He had some weird fetishes, clearly. So, whilst the police were conducting their searches for various things that would obviously potentially lead to my grandmother, they found a secret lockup. In the secret lockup, there was this dodgy porn and pictures of him and his mistress and God knows what else. And in there was a book, an A4 folder, hard folder book. And for a number of years, it was handed over to us. I had it for a number of years. And I read it. But in there, he detailed ultimately a blonde-haired, blue-eyed little boy. He named my nursery. He named the local shop. And he detailed my kidnapping. So the police were worried that something was going to happen to me. And with this domestic dispute at the same time, and the information that had then been shared, is that this kid was sat in the maths lesson, and he's came out and said to me, whatever comment he's made, I'm not going to repeat it because it's just personal, but he made a comment that was derogatory towards my grandmother, and it was derogatory towards my father, and it was derogatory towards my mother at the end of the day. And it detailed he had a lot of information, too much information, and he had two brothers. And children being children, is that they can be very malicious. They don't understand what they're saying. Yeah. I wasn't at fault at the end of the day. I was no different to them. I was just put in a set of circumstances because of my family history. And I went to my head of year, and I said to the head of year, this is what this boy's just said to me. And he confirmed it with the lad, and where his source, more importantly, he confirmed where his source of intel was, which was his father. And his parent, this police officer, was a parent governor. So we've all had a meeting, we've gone into a room similar to this, and we're sat around the table, and he says to the teacher, my head of year, says to my parents, the son has confirmed that his father was the source of intel. So there's been a further meeting. We've said, okay, fine, we need to take this now to the police. We're making a formal complaint. We're escalating this. We're not happy.
Yeah.
We're going to use the proper channels. So we made the complaint. And when that meeting came along, where he had to confirm what had been said, he said, no, that never happened. He never confirmed that it was his father that was the source of intel, right? And I said, he's bent. Now, as I say, 2008, Stephen Eaton was dismissed from Northamptonshire Police Force after kidnapping a 16-year-old boy with two of his colleagues, there was three of them, I think, in total. Nothing to do with me, but driving a 16-year-old lad round in the back of his police car for 3 hours, okay, using CS spray on him, threatening to plant drugs on him, so on and so forth, and he was eventually dismissed from Northamptonshire Police. Now, had they have listened to me as a 14-year-old boy when I said he was bent and he was leaking information, he would have been sacked there and then. That 16-year-old would have never been put in the boot of the car and driven around in a patrol car, marked patrol car. Stephen Eaton, his name is, Google it. So, off the back of that, though, is that the bullying got worse. It intensified. You've now got headlines going out in terms of my grandfather and what was going on there. You've now got a gang of bullies that have got quite juicy information in terms of what this police officer's leaked, right, about my family. And then at the same time, you've got the backlash in terms of ultimately we've made a complaint against this boy's father, blah, blah. And I was attacked. I was attacked by 16 people. I was on my own. Well, I say I was on my own. I took the beating on my own. I was with a couple of friends. It was too much for them, I think, to be honest with you. One of them in court said that the attack was so ferocious he was physically sick. I got taken to hospital. I got up. I've never been a big guy, as you can tell. I took the beating like a man. Curled up in a ball. I got up, spat out a load of blood. I said, it still took 16 of you fuckers to do it, didn't it? I couldn't stand, really. Got carried. And that was it. The school, the police, my parents, I didn't want to go back to that environment. I had enough of getting battered every day. It started off in primary school when we moved to the area, and it just intensified from there. I was a lad from the council estate. I was now living in a very rural location, incredibly rural location at the time, and I don't think it matters what class you are, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Is
that people can be just as vindictive, horrible, nasty, and they didn't understand the consequences. And that's where I really started seeing the impact. So from 14, and I'll be honest, when I left school, I was deprived. I'm self-taught completely in its entirety. I left school with no qualifications whatsoever, zero. I've never had a leavers do, leavers ball. I've never had a leavers shirt. I've never, had any GCSEs or A-levels or anything like that. And I was quite vindictive. I was lost, Billy. I was a lost little boy. I was. I'd been dealing with adult situations from so young. But I didn't have the maturity to be able to process those adult situations and understand. And I think as a young man, you especially, I was resentful. I was incredibly resentful. It wasn't my fault that I didn't have an education. That was my grandfather. It was the police. It was the bullies. It was the school. You should have been able to protect me. How you conduct yourself ultimately when you come from trauma is different to how other children will conduct themselves.
Yeah.
Because they've never experienced it. So for me, I was a polite little boy up until the age of, despite everything, I was incredibly polite. I was incredibly, I wanted to do well. I've always wanted to do well. But I felt that I was handicapped. And I didn't know how to do well because no one had shown me. And whilst, as I say, whilst I love my father and my mother, my mum's been an amazing inspiration, but you need a man to show you how to be a man, ultimately, right? And my father was absent in the most critical of years. He may have been there, but his attention was on something else, a different substance or subject, not his family, right? And I started experimenting with drugs, as we all do. Started getting into fights. I was sick of getting my head kicked in. By 14, I was running around with a kosh. I used to carry a kosh everywhere. I got hit around the head with a skateboard. And when I got hit around the head with the skateboard, I was probably coming on to 15 at this point. Got hit around the head with a skateboard. I done the kid. He hit the floor. He's hit the floor. I said that was a bit of a mistake because he got back up. So I hit him again. And I went home. That was the first time I'd ever hit someone. First time. I went home. His father came up. His father wanted to fight me. Anyway, police turned up. It was self-defence. No further action. We were only boys anyway, young lads. He was in hospital. I got taken into hospital because I obviously split across my head. He had lumps everywhere and went bald. And I said, you know what? No one's ever going to bully me again. That's quite a bold statement, really, when you've been bullied your whole life. And you then set a precedent, don't you? Because then it's like, well...
You've got to stand for something, haven't you? You fall for anything.
Well, yeah. Well, I think the thing is that I articulated myself in the wrong way. But I was trying to, I wanted to commit suicide I wanted to die by the age of 14, 15. I didn't want to be on this planet. If this is what living's like as a kid, fuck being an adult and dealing with all of this bullshit in the background.
Yeah, I see that.
And by 17, I was involved in my father was my Cody. I was involved in an incident where someone was unfortunately run over. And I was remanded in custody. I was put in H&P Woodhill. Then from Woodhill, I went to Glenparva, Dunparva, young offenders. I'd never even been arrested before, other than being questioned at home for when I was 14 for hitting for that fight with that young lad. So I'd never even received a caution or a reprimand, right? And then suddenly, I'm in Woodhill. I'm looking up. That's a big place. That's a scary place. Only cat A years, right? And 18. Must have been a couple of months into my 18th. And I just remember just looking everywhere, and I just thought to myself, fucking hell, you're out of your depth now, boy. You're in the deep end. And it's like anything, is you either sink or swim. You win, lose. You live, die. That's how it works, isn't it? And I staged my case. I was thrown a lifeline ultimately because there was covert surveillance on the group of individuals. I've got an email, but there was covert surveillance on the group of individuals ultimately that said, from one investigating officer to his SIO, there's covert surveillance that corroborates Gillingham's story. And when it came to trial, they had two choices: either release it to the jury or don't. And they opted not to. So the judge said, well, you either leave it on file and drop the charges. So some charges were dropped, others were left on file. And I walked out of court that day. And at that point, Billy, I then realised, okay, that I've never wanted to be, I just wanted to be a normal boy.
Yeah.
I never wanted to be a criminal or anything like that, or, a hard man, or I'm going to sit here and, and try and portray myself as something I wasn't. I was a lost little boy. And I thought to myself, the system has failed me.
Yeah.
I'm becoming a product of the system that I've been brought up in. And a family friend of mine, I was very fortunate where other children may not have been, to have people later on in my life, especially when I got into my late teens, 18, 19, 20, 21, that came into my life, and they realised that I had ability, right? It was just harnessing that ability and being able to mentor me and guide me and be able to teach me to be the best version and share my story to help others and hopefully break the cycle. That's the journey that I've been on for quite some years now, but certainly in the last, I'd say 2 years, I'm trying to break the cycle. And I became involved in a program called the Chrysalis Program, which is a reoffending program. We launched that in the House of Lords, which then went across H&P Reading and H&P Highdown. It then went further across the UK. So that was when I first came out of prison. I was involved in that. So although later on I've become more known for the victim side opposed to the offender management side, originally I wanted to change in terms of young men like me that were lost in the system, and help them articulate and understand where the trauma comes from. No one ever cares what triggered you. They just want to know how you reacted. And for me, it was a case of trying to help others to be able to, like I say, break the cycle, but identify what their red flags are, and what is the
contributing factors.
Yeah,
what's leading up to
what's been developing. What.
See, people don't see. I always say this. You've got to process a lot of stuff growing up from what happens here as a young kid. Not everybody goes through shit. Some people have great, glorious childhoods, but still fuck up somewhere. So something's going on. And similar to yourself, my experience was like there was a lot going on in the background that contributed to my behaviour in the present. The situations that I found myself in, or that I was subjected to and exposed to, were quite traumatic, and I'd bury it with substances because I didn't want to face reality. Take away the substances from me, and reality was quite. It was like I was like quite vulnerable, but didn't want to be shown any kind of vulnerability. It's like someone described it to me once, and he said, "This is what you're like." He said, "There's a lampshade. You take the lampshades off, and there's a bare bulb." He said, "That's you. You're quite raw. You're covering yourself with a lot of shade and walls, and you're hiding behind. So you take that away, and you're bare, aren't you? You're open." So yeah, I get all that, like what's going on in the past brings it to the future, and it's a good point that you're putting across, because there's a lot of young men and young women who are inside or on a wrong path because of what went on at home.
It's got nothing to do with them whatsoever. They're just a product of their environment, and unfortunately they become trapped, and then the cycle is very hard to break. And it is a cycle, it's not a system. No. And unfortunately, prison has some very talented people. Very, very talented. Let's be honest, some of the biggest business brains come from a council estate. And they're not doing legal activities. And if they could use that energy and harness that energy and that intellect and put it into a legitimate business, we'd have so many more entrepreneurs and so many more multimillionaires that are coming from grassroots, and I think that in terms of my journey is that's what I started realising, is that I thought to myself, you know what, I was looking around other people. I didn't want to be a big hard man on a wing. I never had any issues, didn't have to have fights or anything like that. Okay, when I was in jail, I got on all right. I just kept my head down, wasn't there to prove a point. I'm doing my thing. Okay, this is my story, take it as it is. And that was it. And people kind of, to be honest with you, they were more fascinating, because they were just like, what is someone like you doing in a place like this? And I was like, look, to be honest with you, mate, okay, I went on a mad journey one night, okay, and ended up running over someone. And all I was doing was escaping. That's all I was doing, right? And so they were fascinated. And then when they started understanding in terms of my grandparents, and I was saying to them, look, this is my lifestyle, this is my father, this is my mother, and my father's been to prison, my mum's been to prison, my grandfather's still serving life to 20 something.
Is he still away, your grandfather?
Yeah, he's still in prison. Yeah, he was released in because obviously once I left,
he got life for murder, didn't he?
Yeah, he got life, 16-year rec. That was in 1996. When he was resentenced in 2004, they reset the 16 years from 1996.
Did he?
Yeah, so it wasn't a case of it was reset from 2004. It was already. So he became eligible for parole in 2012. And when 2012 came along, we realised it was 2010 was the first time we'd ever done an article in the media ourselves, in terms of actually proactively going to the media and saying, look, we've got a point to prove. And we realised that when he would become eligible in 2012, that we were on a slippery slope. We still didn't have my grandmother at the end of the day.
And was he still denying the fact that he'd killed her?
He wasn't engaging at all. No. And that worked for us, being honest with you. That did actually work for us. And 2010, we wrote to the Prime Minister at the time and said, look, we feel that there should be a law in place that prevents people like my grandfather from being released back into society. There is no doubt whatsoever that he's the one that committed the crime. This can't be a miscarriage of justice. We don't want to deprive people of their ability to be able to challenge their conviction in the first place. But those, like my grandfather, that are coming up for parole at the end of the day, it should be a carrot and stick approach. You give us closure, we give you freedom. That should be how it works. And what we've got to bear in mind is my grandfather's never completed any rehabilitation courses. He's never engaged with the system. All he's done is lie, right? Mm-hmm. So when he became eligible in 2012, is that, you know, that's when we started campaigning. 2014, it really then started really kicking off. I started campaigning. I was 26 years of age at that point in 2014. I'd gone back to prison ultimately for a car crash. I'd been in another car crash, and I was completely legal. But I couldn't remember what had happened ultimately when I'd had the car crash. I'd had a head-on collision, and I was prosecuted for dangerous driving. I was arrested 6 months after it had happened. The insurance had paid out. Guy I'd hit into, I won't mention his name, but his wife was a serving police officer, still is, with the force. I was investigated for it. And when I came out of my shit shower and shave, that's what I called it. I was only away for 5 months, right? So came out. My mum said to me, my father's got his first parole hearing. What am I going to do? I said, we'll fight it. I could see he was really tearing up my mum. Really tearing her up. And it's like any lad, right? You want to protect your mum. I had a 40-foot wall separating us. I've got to be honest with you, Billy. You know, sometimes do I look back and I think to myself, did I put myself in dangerous situations with the hope that maybe actually I'd get closer to him? That's another reason maybe why I went behind the door. But
do you think if you'd have come across him,
I'd have killed him?
You'd have killed him.
Yeah. Not now.
Not now.
Okay.
But the way you were feeling back then, you would have.
Yeah, I'd have taken him.
Yeah.
110%. And it upsets me to say that because it's wrong.
Yeah.
But the evilness. How can you do that to your own daughter? How can you write a book about murdering your grandson? You've already taken your wife and you hid her body so well that there's no sign of her. How do you deserve life? There was a part of me for many years that was incredibly upset. That was incredibly raw. Before they released my grandfather, look, 2014 he has his first parole hearing, right? And I start campaigning. I have 8 parole hearings. In 2016, my grandfather writes, for the first time, a confessional letter. He breaks down in front of the parole board and he says, I killed my wife. In the middle of a parole board, his first ever parole hearing. They stop him. Stop speaking. They should have let him carry on. Anyway, he continues to break down. He then authors this letter. So I called up my solicitor, big up Hodge Udden. And I said to Hodge, how do I get this letter? And I was I was thinking, okay, do we need to go to a court or, what do we need to do? So he said to me, look, mate, it's legal privilege. If it's with his solicitor, it's with legal privilege. He said, and it was a throwaway comment. He said, look, the only way you're ever going to get that letter is you've got 2 choices. You can either break into the office and nick it, or find yourself a bent copper. Well, I wasn't really up for doing any break-ins, so I found myself a bent copper. I got the letter, took this guy out for drinks in London, got him pissed at the Oyster Shed, just off bank, and it came to the end of the night and he agreed to send me the letter off his personal email. So anyway, next day, get the letter, and then my life, or our lives, just turn upside down. We end up doing The Investigator, a British crime story with Simon Cowell. Obviously that went on to Netflix, and there was it was big. The campaign was huge. Obviously Helen's Law, we were heavily involved in Helen's Law. That was over 1 million signatures. There's pictures of me outside Downing Street. I've been in every government building now: Commons, Parliament, House of Lords, Downing Street. I've been everywhere, really. Trying to change our situation and say, this is wrong. I tried doing everything the right way. And in October of 2020, they announced that they were going to release my grandfather. And they knocked me on my feet. She turned my life upside down. And at that point, being honest with you, I really struggled. I struggled to manage my emotions. I locked myself away. I was going into self-destruct mode. I knew I was. I was so angry. Just smashing things up. Fucking kill him. It was wrong. So the day before I found out that my other half was pregnant, I was questioned for threats to kill against a man that I've never met, never set eyes on. I wrote on a parole board, you get what's known as a VPS statement, victim and personal statement, right? Yeah. And so I submitted the VPS to the parole board, and at the bottom of the letter, in one letter that my grandfather had authored, he had put Rockabye Baby as his sign-off. Rockabye Baby upon the treetops, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. And then, however it ends, cradle and all will fall, right? And ultimately, what he was alluding to was Patricia, his mistress. You were the baby, I was the cradle. Ultimately, you've broken our pact by seeing another man. She'd gone to see my grandfather, announced that she was leaving him and that she loved someone else. This in 2016. And that's what provoked him to write the confessional letter. So in this confessional letter, when I got it, okay, in there was, it was 6 pages, and he detailed how he had murdered my grandmother over he had burnt my grandmother over a period of 3 days at the family home. And you start looking into it. Is this feasible? Is this possible? So we've done the Investigator. I'm not going to ruin it for people, but that's what kickstarted the Investigator, British crime story on Netflix. And at the same time, I was still fighting the parole board, despite everything that my grandfather was doing and saying to them and to us now, is that I was still fighting that. And so the day before, as I say, I found out that my partner was pregnant. I was then interviewed for the threats to kill, because I'd quoted John Dryden, beware the fury of a patient man. I said to him, my time will come, so will yours. We will have to, that 40-foot wall will be removed. At that point, the way you're going, this is only going to end one way. So I was hauled in front of the police, and I said to them, my whole life, you've been telling me how he wants to kill us. He's already killed my grandmother. He's hid her body. He said that he would kill he did. He said to the police, if I knew how much of a bitch my daughter would have been, I'd have done her too. Here's the comments. These are his own words. So when I was a kid at 3, 4, 5, 6, 14, 15, 16, 17, that's when I realised the impact that actually this was having. And that's when I actually started. And I was questioned 3 times for threats to kill. No further action each time. I told them each time, if you think that I've done something, by all means charge me, and we'll take this to trial. They never did they? No further action. But the trauma that it was inflicting, and 9 months ago, Billy, I was diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. I've been in therapy ever since, and that's what I'm fighting at the moment. It's managing my own emotions, isn't it? But also reprogramming and realising that you've got to let go of the hate. I hate my grandfather. But I don't anymore. I pity him. What a miserable life. 79, coming on to 79 years of age and still in prison. No family, no savings, nothing. What does he have? So that hate, I've started to let it go. It's taken a long time. I call my boy my saviour. He saved 2 lives. 110%. He saved Russell's and he saved mine. And in October of 2020, they release him. And that's what then really put me on my knees. Really put me on my knees. Took me to the hardest year, 2020 through to present day, was the hardest point of my life. And then in November of 21, it's only a few months ago, they recall him. They say, he's breached. What's he done? Can't tell you. And so he's back inside.
So for someone at 79 to be out, to actually breach his licence within 11 months, you must have been up to
Must have been doing something.
There's obviously, you look at like something. Then again, you know our mate Kev Lane has been pulled in for fuck all in the past, haven't we, Kev? Kev shitting at the back, so that's why we're referencing.
But I think the thing is, though, with like, and this is what annoyed me, right? It's like they rewarded my grandfather, but then they punished people like Kevin.
Yeah.
And that really vexed me. Because how can you reward one man with freedom? Because what you got to bear in mind is when he wrote that 6-page confessional letter, okay, and this is really important for the viewers. He wrote that 6-page confessional letter and he maintained that for 2 years. For 2 years, okay, he met with Dorset Police on several occasions and said to them, I don't give a fuck what you say. I know what I did. I know what I saw. I burnt her for 3 days in the back garden. That's what I did. Take it or leave it. Now, you start accepting that that's the fate of your loved one. Yeah. You think to yourself, oh, okay, then that's the fate of your loved one. And you come to an acceptance point. And when we were finally starting to come to that acceptance point, we thought, okay, then, well, that's what happened to her. At least we can take some comfort knowing her final moments. He then retracted it. And he said, I know I said that for 2 years, but actually, I didn't do that. I buried her in a beautiful and idyllic location. And I'm not going to tell you, right? So we were like, what the hell? And he maintained that for 3 months. Yeah. And then he withdrew it. And he said, he didn't withdraw it to us, by the way.
He's like a pathological liar then, isn't he?
He then said, I didn't bury her in a beautiful, idyllic location. I didn't burn her for 3 days either. I'm a miscarriage of justice. I've never committed murder. Right, to the parole board. And then 12 months later, he has his next parole hearing, and he says to them, I know that I said that I burned her for 3 days, and I withdrew that, and I then said that I buried her in a beautiful and idyllic location. Well, I didn't do either of those things, and I've never committed murder. And then he went, but actually, I revert back to my first ever statement. I wasn't the killer, but I did dissolve it. I did get rid of the body, right?
That doesn't make
and
sense,
they release him,
yeah.
And they release him for it. So, as a family, behind the scenes, you're constantly being chucked around. And you only get over one thing, and you're finally starting to cope with that, and then they throw a next curveball. Yeah. And it was a bit like even when they recalled me. Now, they recalled him when they recalled my grandfather. Now, they recalled him in the November. On the 13th of October, I believe it was, they had wrote to us to say that Russell Causley was reintegrating well into society, and that he was no cause for concern. There was no cause for concern. 2 weeks later, they recall him. What was the shift? What was the change? So you're constantly having to
be on your toes with it.
Yeah, you're constantly moving, and like I say, when you get over one thing, they then throw another curveball, and then it's like, shit, okay, then, and you're trying to get your head around that. And I think that that's where a lot of the trauma, especially in the later life, like.
Can I ask you a question? Do you think you'll be relieved when you finally find out he's died?
Yeah, I said to Kevin last night. Yeah. We're out for drinks. I said, I've got a feeling in my body, I know it sounds weird, he's going to die in the next 12 months. Yeah. I said, I know this sounds terrible, and I wouldn't wish death upon anybody, okay? But if
probably
one
cold, person, it's fucking hell, everyone's eyes are out at the minute, don't they?
Well, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, when COVID came along, right, I thought to myself, all right, then, well, we've got a fair chance, you know what I mean, of doing him in, naturally. I know it sounds terrible, but I kind of just want to end the suffering. I don't want to keep on giving him a platform. I know this sounds terrible, but I've constantly got to give him a platform to try and find my grandmother, because there's someone out there that knows where my grandmother is. There's got to be someone out there that knows where my grandmother is.
And you just want to lay it at rest, don't you?
I just want to lay it. I'm not interested in justice. No. If someone was to turn around and say, oh, look, I was implicated in that murder, okay, do you honestly think I'm going to go squawk into the old bill? I couldn't give a toss about a conviction, mate. Could not care less. All I want is to be able to lay her to rest and be able to give my mum the peace and the closure and the justice that she deserves.
And you believe someone out there knows that?
110%.
So if anyone's out there that does know that and is watching this, you'd like it, even if it was to maintain anonymity and
anything. Look, we're not.
I don't think anyone's going to start forthcomingly like.
You never know.
You never know.
You never know.
You never know.
And that's what provokes me to keep on speaking. It isn't because I don't want any recognition for anything I've done. I haven't done it for myself. I've done it for my family. So I don't want the recognition. I don't want anything like that. And I'll tell you what. If I find my grandmother, I'll shut up. I'll stop talking to people. I'll stop going in the press. I'll stop making documentaries.
Yeah.
I'll stop trying to hold people to account in government and say to them, you're wrong. How could you recall him and then 4 months, 5 months later say, actually, we made a big mistake? Oh, executive release. But then they're letting people like my grandfather out of prison. How is that right? How is that fair? How is that equal justice? That isn't equal. You're not treating two offenders, apparently convicted of the same index offence, exactly the same. You're recalling one man and destroying his businesses and his family, and at the same time rewarding someone, okay, who's got absolutely fucking sweet nothing. And you're saying, okay, then, well, you can behave like that. You can show absolute contempt in the front of the parole board. 8 parole hearings. And you kind of think to yourself, like, where is the one is the parole board fit for purpose, right? Because I don't think there's enough transparency. I think there needs to be more public scrutiny. We convict in an open courtroom and we release in a closed court. Bonkers. How does that work? And I don't think it is fit for purpose anymore. And I think that the victim and the offender needs to be able to hold the government to account. The taxpayer, the government needs to justify to the taxpayer the cost of holding these individuals inside. What, 37.5 grand for a normal person per year, right? It's a lot of money. Now, prison shouldn't be a clock watching exercise. It should be an opportunity for you to be able to address the root causes of your offending behaviour and understand and have accountability that it isn't right to go around punching people, it isn't right to go around stabbing people, robbing people, whatever it is that you've done to put yourself in that set of situation, that set of circumstances, right? So I think he needs to die. I don't mean that horribly, like with any maliciousness, okay? But he's 78, 79 years of age. I think he's had good innings. I think he's had a good run for his money, all things considering. And I think he just needs to shut up, go to sleep permanently, and allow us to have justice. He should give his own daughter, not me, I don't know him, he doesn't owe me anything, but he does owe his daughter something. Give your daughter closure, not us.
And that's it, really. That's like we're obviously coming to an end, and you've shared a lot.
Mate,
it's massive.
I've tried condensing it down.
No,
it's so difficult, mate.
I can imagine. I can see the pain and the suffering that you've been through. You know, and the trauma that you're bringing up, and it does bring up a lot all the time. You know, and it is what it is at the moment, and hopefully that'll change in the future. You know, we don't fucking know, do we? It's not. I wouldn't like to be in that situation where I had a grandmother and we didn't know where she was buried or where she was.
I don't even have a death certificate.
Exactly. So I
don't even have a death certificate. How bad's that?
It is. It's quite tough.
And if I want a death certificate, do you know what's mad about it? It'll cost me 500 quid. Okay, and I have to go into a courtroom and satisfy a judge that my grandmother's actually dead.
Yeah. So
to be able to get a death certificate.
It's heavy, isn't it?
And they can't put a causation. They can't put a time. They can't put a date. They can't put a location. So all they're going to do is give me a blank piece of paper and charge me £500 for a death certificate.
Shit, isn't it? Fucking hell. Right. Don't know what more to say, to be fair.
Billy, thank you.
You're welcome. But what I do say at the end of every podcast is, like, what would you say to a young...
You are...
a young Nick Gillingham coming through the doors of life.
Have faith.
I forgot your name for a moment. I was thinking, I'm going to call you Carl Frock. I was thinking, I'm like yourself, I lose me saying the but Nick. Yeah.
No, what would I say to a young person? If I was to a younger version of me.
I mean, obviously, not every young person is going to be in the same situation as yourself.
Look, have faith.
Yeah.
Stay humble. Have integrity. But don't give up. And, you know, it doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter how small you are. It's the heart that's inside of you. Yeah. It's the size of the fight. As I say, when I was 14, I said that I'd never let anybody bully me again. I don't care who you are. Whether you're the government, Prime Minister, I've taken it to his front door and I'll take it to anybody else's front door at the end of the day. And there's not many victims that can say that. And I said I'll take it to his front door and I took it to his bloody front door. Million people supporting us.
Brilliant.
And, you know, the thing is that I would say to anybody is that I think people don't want to know what triggered you. They just want to know how you reacted and how you responded. You're the creator of your own destiny, and have faith. And don't let anybody ever tell you that you can't achieve something, because if you genuinely believe and you're a good person and you're hardworking and you focus and investing in yourself, and sometimes there has to be some awkward conversations that you have to have with yourself.
Yeah,
I've had to have quite a few awkward conversations with myself. I'm fighting a demon, and the demon is myself, right? But there's a saying, isn't there? The greatest victory of any is being able to conquer yourself. And that's what I'd say to anybody is keep working, do it legally, not illegally. Don't let your trauma dictate your future. That shouldn't be your future should never be determined by a third party. It'd be criminal to allow my grandfather to have any more impact on my life for a man that I've never met, that I don't call family. I wouldn't piss on him if he was on fire. I'm not saying I'd pour petrol on him, but I'd probably, I'd just say to anybody, you just need to do things the right way and don't lose faith.
And with that, mate, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.